Okay, guys, let's get started with the lecture today. Today I want to talk to you about the wisdom of crowds, and where this fits into the overall lecture where we are so far. Remember, we talked about different levels, right, about the macro and the micro level. And to do it, then you're going to see an example for why it is so important to distinguish these kind of things. Why, based on knowledge about one level, about individuals, we cannot necessarily say something about crowds. So that's what today is about. Before we get started, that happen, and that's sort of the wisdom, the phenomena that we call the wisdom of the crowd, where suddenly when we kind of look at crowds together, they are actually incredibly smart. Yeah. It's actually funny. A couple of years ago, I taught this lecture to students. I taught them about how incredibly smart they are collectively, and they really fucked an exercise up that I wanted them to do. So they just didn't get something done at all. But we come to that in a second. So before we talk about the wisdom of the crowd, let me talk about the madness of the crowd. Yeah? And in this regard, let's go back a little bit historically. You know, we nowadays live in a society, you know, I don't know, we have a democracy where everybody has a vote, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their gender, regardless of their social class background, regardless of their intelligence, right? And, not that long ago, people actually thought, hang on, that's actually a very stupid way of organizing society. And Friedrich Nietzsche, here the quote, he said, madness is the exception in individuals, but the rule in groups. So he thought that, okay, groups, they always go just crazy. I don't know, maybe you can think about organizing a group, trying to get 10 people together. Sometimes I think about, I don't know, I tried last week to organize 6 colleagues of mine to have a work group meeting on how we deal with tutorials in the first and the second year, because I'm head of teaching and learning at the moment. And it's like a kindergarten, you know, just to get 6 people, they're all intelligent people, get them together in a way, and you wonder, what the hell, you know, what's going on here? There's another guy, historian Thomas Carlyle, he said, I do not believe in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. So his point was, how can a collective be clever when individuals are ignorant in it? Right? Or Gustave Le Bon, he said that in crowds it is stupidity and not mother wit that is accumulated. So in crowds, you know, they just become really stupid, you know, and they just behave like lemmings, and I don't know. And this is where democracy actually is. So Thomas Jefferson, he had this nice quote. He said, a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49%. Yeah. And then we get something like this, you know, and you wonder, how the hell could that happen? You know, actually, right now, it looks like, I don't know, it looks like the guy is going to get reelected, to be honest, as we see it right now. And you wonder, okay, hang on a moment, what's going on here? What's going on here? And now Francis Galton came into place. He was like a statistician back in the day. We'll talk more about him later, in 1900, around that. Interestingly, he was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And he, you know, at 1900, he thought about that and said, how can a country with democracy, you know, where a large mass of uneducated people vote their leaders, ever be run better than a country run by the elite and experts? Yeah. And when you think like 200-300 years ago, that's actually how the country was run, you know? Actually, there was a very small class of people, and the ordinary people had no right to say, they had no way of contributing. They were sort of blocks in their way. Okay, so that's like where people started and thought, okay, when we have like, you know, if you think about it, if you could choose, okay, one very intelligent guy to solve something, or you kind of give it to 100 stupid guys to solve it, who would you give it to? Yeah? I don't know. But now something, the phenomena of the wisdom of crowd comes into play, which is very, very odd and very confusing. So in that regard, now I have something else to do. Let's see if I figure that out. So again, you know, there should be a second question now in your thing. And basically, what I have here like a jar of candy. Yeah. So you see this here. So I'm asking you about how many candies do you think are in this jar? Yeah. Well, there we have. I put it down here. So please kind of check out the website. I hope that I figure this this time. Here we are. Yeah. Is it working? Yeah, it's working. Okay, great. It's a thing where Windows tries to be smarter than you, where PowerPoint tries to be smarter than you, you know, and then you have like two screens, and then where the fuck is it? Yeah, so I hold it up here. How many candies are in that jar? You know, okay. Everybody done? Everybody done? Okay. So now actually what I want you to do, now we go to the next one. Now actually I want you to, I don't know, just chat with a neighbor about what you think, how many ones there are, and then I want to ask you to fill out that thing again. But chat with your neighbor about it. Yeah? I shake it a little bit. No? So exciting. Yeah, okay, everybody done? Well, we have 6 people who've done it so far. Give me your votes. You see what is happening right now? Actually, right now I deliberately, I bring social influence into the game here, right? Before I didn't, by kind of not showing you what others did, right? And you were quiet, you didn't talk with each other, which was great. Because the theory, as it suggested, there's going to be different results here. So I have no idea. Let's see. So this one, here we had like 24.7, which was the one where you guys did not talk with each other. And the one where you guys talked with each other, we have like 30. Yeah. So the theory actually says that the second one should be worse, should be less accurate than the first one. But we're going to figure that out later on. I don't know, we're going to count that. I didn't count it. You know, you guys are going to count it. And this is where the other quarter student really fucked that up. You know, they didn't manage to count the bloody candy. Yeah. So it was, they just were so excited about candy, you know, and they just forgot about what candy. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass it around, or actually you guys pass it around, and please take one. But also pass on the number so that we know at the end of the day how many candies are in that jar. Right? So you take one. I don't know, you guys are clever enough, you know, figure that out. Just make sure that at the end I get a number from you guys. Because otherwise it can be very anticlimactic. Yeah? There's this whole build-up of candy, but we don't really know what the result is. Okay. So I asked you to count, and we'll come back to that in a second, how many there actually are. So what is going on here? Well, this is actually an exercise that is very similar to what this guy, Francis Galton, actually did back in the days. In 1906, he was a statistician, but at the time, you know, I don't know, when you were an academic, you thought about figuring out life and the world and everything at the same time in a way. So he was also thinking about the political system, democracy, and so on. And he kind of wanted to. He was convinced of this idea that crowds that are suddenly getting involved in politics, that they should make worse decisions than the experts. Now, that was like his way of thinking, how he came about. And so now he stumbled. What the guy did, you know, he was like one of the British aristocrats at the time. So one weekend he went to this livestock fair, as one did back in those days. One goes to these livestock fairs where I don't know, animals were on display. There were, I don't know, all sorts of activities. And actually, I was at one of those livestock fairs. 4 years ago, I lived in Texas for a bit. And as one does in Texas, one goes to a livestock fair at the weekend. There's a rodeo, actually, which is crazy, which is really violent when you think about it. It was quite a shock. But Francis Galton, he kind of was at this livestock fair, and as it happened, there was a competition that was going on there. So there was an ox standing in the middle, and people could cast a vote. They could cast a vote on what they think is the weight of that ox. Yeah? And Galton thought, okay, and as being a good statistician, he afterwards actually took that data and kind of looked at it and wanted to know, so what is sort of like the average guess?
It was 30, so yeah.
30?
I got it right.
30, so we have 6 more, 2, 4, 6 more, so it's actually 36. So what you see here a little bit already is, we have 30 in total?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 30 in total. So remember, your first guess was like, I think 26, and after you guys talked with each other, your guess was 30, right?
Yeah. Strange.
Whoa! This is magic. This is magic. This is magic. Actually, I've done a similar thing with my, until a few years ago, I was teaching the Introduction to Research Methods. I've done it with 500 students. And there I've done actually the thing, of, not with candy, I don't have 500 candy, and that didn't work. But I repeated what Galton was doing. So actually he kind of, you remember, people kind of cast their vote about the weight of that ox, So they saw that ox in front of them, and people, around 800 people, cast their vote on that. And Galton, he collected the guesses from after the competition was over. And then the median guess of the weight of that ox, again, like, I don't know, what's the weight of that ox? I have no idea. Is an ox like 200 kilograms? Is it 2,000? I have no idea. Yeah? And probably you are in the same way, unless you are a farmer, and again, maybe then you know it, but even then. No, because it's something we don't encounter on our daily life. What is the weight of an ox? So anyway, so Galton, he kind of looked at all those 800 responses that he got at this livestock fair, and the median guess was 1,207 pounds. Remember median, it's a bit like the average, it's really just the one in the middle, so 50% of the guesses are higher and 50% of the guesses are lower. That's what the median is. And then he actually looked at the real weight of the ox, and the real weight of the ox was 1,198. That's 9 pounds off, that's 4.5 kilos off. Out of a big ox, yeah? That's crazy. But actually it's very similar to what you guys did here right now as well. I don't know, you saw this thing, you didn't really see it properly, and you were bang on. That's crazy. How the hell does that work? But actually, I'm not really surprised. As I said, I've done that in Lecture Theatre L, and I've showed people this cow. Actually, she's called Penelope. And I know that because there's a whole podcast around it in a way, which is quite funny anyway. So I showed students this cow. 150 students, they took part of that little survey, and the average guess of the males was 608, and the average guess of the females was 408. I don't really know what the median was right now. Apparently, I didn't calculate it at the time. And, and this cow, Penelope, her weight is 615 kilograms. So again, what you see here is that the guesses are incredibly close. Well, actually, for the males, no single male was better than the average guess of the males. So everybody was worse off than the average. And only 31% of the females were better than the female average guess, and so on, or in general, only 22% were better than the average guess. So you see, actually, 78% of the students were worse than the average guess. And that's not surprising. It's actually the same thing as we did over here. Like that collectively, you were actually bang on with that. So, as I said, there was a nice little podcast that repeated that with, with 17,000 people. And what you see here is, again, like the distribution, the weight distribution of the guesses of the people. And in the middle, you see the line. Here we are in the middle. So here you see, actually, this is where the true weight is, and you see the distribution is actually very close. It's really very close. It's scarily close. And then once they've done it with experts were actually less accurate than people that had no idea, right? So that's actually a very funny one. So you go and you talk to farmers who should know their business in a way. They were actually not as good as the people that were not experts in that field. How did that work? Well, this is sort of what we call the wisdom of the crowds, and this was the reading that you guys had to do for today. James Rebecca, it's like a fun read. This book is actually very easy to read. So he says, under the right circumstances, groups are remarkably intelligent and are often smarter than the smartest people in them. Groups will need to be dominated by exceptionally intelligent people in order to be smart. Even if most of the people within a group are not especially well informed or rational, it can still reach a collectively wise decision. How is that possible? Okay, so this is an example that you guys might know. You all know the show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Yeah, okay. So in this show, it's like a question and answer show, and there are 3 lifelines. The 50-50 Joe, go phone a friend and ask the audience. And maybe you ever wondered about why the audience is always so clever. They always seem to get it right. Yeah? And there are sort of certain questions. So here's an example. Like when Sherlock Holmes retired from detective work, what profession did he take up? I have no idea. Yeah. So I make a guess, others make a guess. And then you see the distribution of what comes out of it. So most people, 64% say C, which is actually the correct answer. Yeah. So how is that possible? Well, the answer here is the following, that even small pieces of, even if you don't know the answer, there's still sort of a piece of information that you can contribute. For example, I'm pretty certain that it was not painting. Yeah? I don't know, because that just doesn't fit with, I don't know, maybe this is what I'm thinking. Yeah? And so I kind of choose one of the first 3. And maybe I make a random guess from these 3, But I kind of, the thing that I kind of know it's less likely to be D, and that's why I ruled that out, that kind of adds some information to it. So maybe you think, okay, it's maybe either C or D. And you think, okay, it's not the first one, you don't even know what the first one is. And you think, okay, Metze, no, that was not Metze, it was Dr. Watson, he was that guy. Anyway. So maybe you then know, maybe you think it's either C or D. Again, you might not know it. So what you do, you make a random guess between the 2, right? And that's sort of how the little pieces of information that everybody contributes, if we even if we don't know which one it is out of the remaining 2 or 3 in a way, it kind of adds up when you have larger groups of people. Because some people will randomly choose the C, and others will randomly choose the D, right? And that's sort of how you get this distribution, how little pieces of information add up here. And it actually turns out, when you look at the statistics of that, of all the time and all the shows, the audience is right in 91% of the times. It's crazy. Yeah? It's really crazy, but it's actually not surprising, because there's little pieces of information that is still there, that is still getting used, even when you don't know individually the right answer. And one example that James Rebecca talks about in this book is the disaster of the Challenger. There was like a space shuttle back in the days, in the 1980s, and this space shuttle exploded after the start. And 73 seconds into the flight, it blew up. And interestingly, the moment it blew up, or as these things happen, the stock market reacted violently to it. Especially towards the companies that were involved in building this spacecraft, even though they didn't really know yet what caused the problem, right? And so within seconds or within minutes, actually the biggest loser of the companies was a company called Morton Thiokol. It's like a small company. And as it turns out, whatever they produced, which was this O-ring, which was faulty in a way because it was cold and things like that in a way, that actually caused it. So their product caused it. But within seconds, within minutes, the stock market seemed to have figured that out, while the investigation took on months to come to that conclusion. And there are other examples about, I think in the book he also talks about a lost submarine in a way, how collectively, actually problems can be solved in a much faster way than individuals could possibly do. So how does that work? Again, now I have a little video to look at this a little more.
You're watching the Nova Science Now video podcast.
In an election year, people might disagree about who makes the best candidate, but you don't hear much argument on the merits of democracy, that millions of average people can together make a wise decision. It wasn't always so. In the early 20th century, this controversial Englishman, Sir Francis Galton, tried to statistically test where the mobs of common folk were capable of choosing well. And, as our musical correspondent Rob Morseberger tells us, what Sir Francis actually found was that, mathematically at least, there's often wisdom in a crowd.
Sir Francis Galton was a nobleman and scorned the common masses. He thought that votes of governance should be left to higher classes. He'd prove with all the data from a contest inescapable of guessing even simple things the commoners were incapable.
Ladies and gentlemen, step right up.
What kind of contest might it be?
Guess the ox's weight and see. Guess the weight correctly and win a prize.
It's 100.
Said a little one.
That's much too light. At least a ton.
An eager crowd queued up to play. 800 made a guess that day.
So we had 800 data points.
And now the ox's weight is exactly 1,198 pounds. There are no winners.
Sir Francis knew the rabble would never guess the weight. How might they judge important things if left to meet that fate? With mathematics, he would show how far they went astray. But in the end, his theory was in total disarray. Because a curve of all the guesses...
Oh, that curve? It's the cumulative distribution function of the normal distribution. Sorry, that's what it's called.
Because graphing all the guesses and determining their mean...
I think he was talking about the median.
And determining their median, he showed that if the crowd were one, its estimate is keen. He showed that if the crowd were one, its estimate is keen.
Keen, yes.
That's because while no individual guessed the actual weight, the average of all the guesses is exactly right.
The average will generally be better than a randomly selected individual guess.
The average of the masses assures us of success.
I think he was talking about the median.
And the larger the number of guesses we toss in,
The more likely we are to get the right answer about the oxen.
this premature prognostication, they cannot help but scoff.
Galton should have gathered more data before he went shooting his mouth off.
Sir Francis's hypothesis was rocked by ignoramuses. He lost the proof he had avowed. He found the wisdom of the crowds.
If you have a group of people and they each have tiny bits of information, then you can learn a lot if we could just gather all of those bits together.
It's just like Wikipedia.
Well, this isn't exactly like Wikipedia. No. It's a little bit different.
It could maybe be Wikipedia. You don't even need to be an expert, but if you know something, then you're able to contribute, and that entry is able to be that much more informed.
Another sample of this fair?
Who wants to be a millionaire?
Yeah, the Audience Lifeline.
If a person feels like they can't answer the question by themselves, ask the audience.
The audience is right over 90% of the time.
There you go.
How about that, Gelman?
The wrong Gelman.
Sorry.
One by one, we're not too smart, but every guess, it plays its part. And when you add them up, you'll find the wisdom of the crowd.
For more fun science stories, watch.
So a little funny video, but you saw the point. You know, there's actually, we replicated it here with the candy. It was like the similar idea. Like we have individual guesses in a way that are not necessarily informed, but collectively somehow the group is doing really well. And the story here was like tiny little pieces of information. Like say one of you thinks that this is definitely not more than 100. Yeah, and somebody else thinks this is definitely more than 10 in a way. You know, and then around the other things, the options that you think, you kind of just randomly make guesses around that in a way. So even the small little pieces of information, even though you might not have the exact number right, you know, the fact that you know this might not be more than 100, or the fact that you might think with good certainty, I don't know, this is definitely more than 10 in a way, that kind of adds up. And think of the example of the who wants to be a millionaire. You know, 4 questions, you can rule one out, and out of the other 3, you make a random guess. I don't know. Somebody else can rule another one out, has another 3, makes a random guess. Now, if you have lots of people doing that, you kind of get that distribution where sometimes, I don't know, you guess right or wrong, but the other person kind of chooses between the other one in a way. So there's information that feeds into that. Okay, so when does it work, the conditions of the wisdom of the crowd? And that's what James actually talked about in the reading that you guys had to do for today. So the first one is we need to have diversity of opinion. Okay, so if everybody kind of has thinks in the same way, it doesn't work. It's a little counterintuitive because you would kind of think, okay, if everybody knows it, we would be best. But actually by knowing different things, it actually works best. Second one is independence of members. So people shouldn't influence each other. Then kind of this is how this thing works out in a better way. There should be decentralization and there should be a method of aggregating opinions. There's more about that in the paper, in the article. I'm going to talk about the first 2 a little more. So let me talk about diversity. And so actually there's a scientific reason why having diverse groups is actually a good idea. You know, there's a whole push, and I don't know, I'm all supportive of that, of having diverse groups. It starts with committees, I don't know, where we want to increase gender balance and all sorts of other things, you know. Actually, there's a scientific reason for that. Diversity is really good for groups. So bringing new members into the organization, even if they're less experienced and less capable, actually makes the group smarter, simply because what little the new members do know is not redundant with what everybody else knows. So you get a different view on things. So diverse groups are better problem solvers, actually. So only smart people tend to resemble each other in what they can do, but kind of having different kinds of people kind of brings different strategies, different problem-solving abilities to the table. So the group as a whole does not benefit from 2 people knowing exactly the same thing. It's a bit like when I go to a conference and people tell me what I already know. I think, God, this is a waste of my time. You know, so I want to kind of expose yourself to people who know something else in a way. That's sort of how you get better, because otherwise the information you get is redundant. So adding a few people who know less but have different skills actually improves the group's performance. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you another paper which is highly abstract. You know, this is a very abstract paper, but sort of to get a feel for how diversity can actually increase a group's problem-solving abilities. It's a paper by Hong and Page. You know, they kind of have a paper in PNS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and the paper is a very stylized paper. So they present a model, you know, which is abstract, yeah, just to convey an idea, and their model that they present is the following scenario. Yeah? Kind of people have different ways of how they can solve a problem. People have different heuristics. He calls that heuristics. It's like a strategy. It's like a rule. I don't know. I can go to the library. You can call a friend. You know, there's a different heuristics. And in his world here right now, what you see here is like, I don't know, I simplify the whole thing, and the paper is actually a little more complicated. So what you see here right now is 18 positions with a number attached to it. Yeah? And each of these positions resembles a possible solution of a problem. Yeah? Okay, and you see these numbers. These numbers are now reflect the idea of how good is that solution. So basically, when you end up at a spot that has a higher number, you found a better solution to the problem. And that's sort of what this kind of means. And now people can they all start at the top with their problem-solving abilities, with their heuristics that they have, and they can go about and find a better solution. And now we have like 3 individuals as an example. Yeah, again, I simplified that. So we have the gray individual, and the gray individual, what that individual can do, can either stand where the individual starts. So in this case, the solution would be 2, which seems to be like a crappy solution out of the ones that we have. Or alternatively, the gray individual can take 4 steps, but only once. So that gray individual ends up with a solution that has the score 81. Now, so what should that individual do? Take the 4 steps and find the solution that is 81. Okay. So that's the best solution that the gray individual can reach. Now let's talk about another individual. So the individual, the red individual. And now the heuristic that we have here is, okay, that individual can take 9 steps and multiple times. So again, the individual can start with 2. Or the individual can go on 9 steps. You would end up with 16 down there. Right? Or then go on again, and then actually you end up with 2 at the top again. So what is the best solution that individual 2 can reach? Well, it's 16, like taking 1 step. Okay, now we have the green individual. Maybe you see the logic. Now that individual can take 6 steps, but also multiple times. And because there are 18 positions, there are exactly 3 spots that this individual can land on. 18, 66, and 2. And the best solution for that individual would be that one. Yeah. Okay, everybody on board? This is quite abstract. So it's quite abstract. It's a heuristic. So this is a world where each position represents a possible solution to a problem. Yeah? So we have one problem and people can find a solution to that. And now the individuals, they have a certain rule that they can do. So the gray individual can either stand still or take 4 steps. That's sort of just the rule that behavior rule that individual can have. It's like that individual's heuristics, that individual's ability to solve a problem. Strategy that individual can evoke. And in this abstract world, that individual kind of could end up either here with 2 or with 81. And the number corresponds, again, this is very abstract, but the number corresponds to how good the solution is. And so the red individual, has the heuristic, can take 9 steps, but multiple times, can end up here or at the top again. They all start at the top. This is where the starting point is. So that red individual can reach the solution 16 or number 2, right? So for the red individual, the 16 is the best one. But the green individual can take 6 steps. Again, starts at the very top, right? If you take 6 steps from the very top, you end up with the solution 18. If you go another 6 steps, you would end up with the solution 66. So for that individual, the solution 66 would be the highest. Is that now clear? I know this is quite abstract. It's quite abstract. But the key here is the following: that now for who's the best one? Well, the gray one, right? The gray individual reaches the highest solution. Okay, that's nothing fancy. And now let's have the red and the green individual join forces. Keep in mind, individually they're not very clever. Individually they don't solve the problem better than 66. That's what the green individual can get, and the red individual can get 16. So now we have them join their forces, and now they have, instead of just being able to do the one or the other, they can do both of their things, right? They can take 9 steps multiple times, and they can take 6 steps multiple times. So we join their forces. Now I represent this with this new individual, which is actually with the orangey brown individual, which is really like just the red and the green individual together. So when we look at where they can end up with, well, actually now you see they can end up in different positions. So how can they end up there? Well, the first one, you need to think they all start over here, right? So let's say they can, in the first they can either take 9 or 6 steps. If they take 9 steps, they end up here, right? We already know that. Okay. If they take 6 steps, they end up here. Okay. So in the next step, again, they can either take 9 or 6 steps. If from here they take 9 steps, they end up there again. If from here they take 9 steps, no, actually they end up here, right? Or if from here they take 6 steps, they also end up here. But if they take from here 6 steps, they end up here. Yeah. And now the same thing. So if from here they now take 9 steps, now they end up there, right? Or if from here they take 6 steps, they end up there. Right? So this is how it goes. Can everybody see that? Yeah. So these are sort of the solution that they can reach. And now what you see, their best solution is actually now 91. So that is actually higher than their individual solutions that they could find. So now we have this situation where if you kind of join their problem-solving strategies together, even though individually they are actually not that good, together they get a much better solution, which is actually higher than of the gray individual, which was a much better problem solver to begin with. You see, this is very abstract, this paper, but just to get that point across about how individual strategies that are individually not that good can outcompete a strategy that is much better when you can combine them. But with the wisdom of the crowds, remember the other way to remember that is think of the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and everybody contributing a little piece of information to the whole thing. Okay, so that's how diversity works. And actually, it's really fascinating. You can actually simulate that. It's actually a fun little project. I simulated that at some point. And you can then throw in social influence because that, in theory, should kind of make the whole thing break down. There are a couple of really interesting papers around in that regard about how group diversity can actually lead to better solutions and how, as soon as you reduce the diversity in the group, the group's problem-solving abilities get destroyed or they are not that good anymore. And again, that's kind of counterintuitive because you could say, okay, well, if we have social influence, the good information, the one who really knows it should spread it to others in a way. But with that mechanism, you actually lose diversity, right? So if everybody is equally susceptible to social influence and you kind of have a social influence mechanism, normally the result gets worse. But then there's another very interesting follow-up paper, which was just published last year by Damien Centula, where he made that point that actually social influence does not work homogeneously. So people who are less sure about what the result is are more susceptible to influence. Yeah? And that kind of outweighs that, again, a little bit. But group diversity really matters. The second one is independence. And so here, Sociology says, the more influence a group's member exert on each other and the more personal contact they have with each other, the less likely it is that the group's decisions will be wise ones. Why? Because through influence, diversity normally gets reduced. So people's opinions are not determined by the opinions of those around them. It keeps people's mistakes from becoming correlated or more likely to have new information. I don't really know what I want to say here. There are some studies that kind of show that the wisdom of the crowd seems to fail, seems to not be as good anymore as soon as there's social influence happening. And that's in this paper by Lawrence and others, which is actually a research group that I was working with a couple of years ago, also published in PNAS. So they set up this experiment, like a laboratory experiment, where students came in a controlled environment, and they did a little bit of experiment like we did here. But they kind of then applied, when you have an experiment, you have, in the simplest case, you have a control and a treatment group, and then you can compare the treatment in the control group, and if you kind of assume that everything else is randomly assigned, and you don't really select people into the one or into the other group, then you kind of can say that the only thing that is different between the two is that to the one you administered the treatment and to the other group you didn't. So, I don't know, one group you give the green pill and the other group you get the red pill. So any difference that you kind of then find from that, if everything else is assigned at random, you don't really care about who sits where or what not in a way, then the difference between the two groups should be because of the treatment. And what they did here, they had like individual students coming in, they assigned them randomly to a treatment group and others to a control group. And they looked at before and after, there's a little more about how experiments work. And so in this paper, there was a laboratory experiment. So in social science, we can do fascinating laboratory experiments. I think it's all online experiments. It's actually really cool. So it's not just restricted to the sciences. So in this case, 144 individuals came in, and they kind of split them up in groups of 12. And then these group of 12 had to solve different estimation tasks. And at the end, they kind of looked at how correct were they in the problem that they had to solve. And the problems they had to solve was something like they were asked about, okay, what is the population density of Switzerland? This was a study conducted in Switzerland. Or another question was, like, what is the border length between Switzerland and Italy? Again, these are kind of questions where you think, it's a bit like the ox, yeah? You don't really know. What is the border between Italy and Switzerland? I don't know. Is it 200 kilometers? Is it 1,000 kilometers? Is it 5,000 kilometers? There you go. It's these kind of questions. Or others like new immigrants to Zurich, or how many murders there were, or how many rapes, or how many assaults there were. And we see the true value, and then we also see, the arithmetic mean, the geometric mean, and the median. And when you look at the median, I remember in Galton's experiment, this is like the thing that he looked at as well. So this is the true value, right? And this is the median. So when you compare these numbers, again, you find striking similarities. The population density, I don't know, the true value is 184, median is 130, or number of new immigrants at Zurich, the true value is 10,067, and the median is 10,000. Or the murders in Switzerland. How many murders are there in Switzerland? I don't know. This is not something that you might know straight away. How many murders are there in Ireland? Yeah? I don't know. So the true value was 198, and the median was 170. So again, the numbers were actually very reasonable. They're very close to that. So, but that was like just the starting of that. This is a bit like what we did. Yeah, this is what we did. This is like the control group, and then they repeated that. They repeated that actually students and participants had to answer these questions 5 times in different rounds. And in the control group, they were given no additional information. But in the treatment group, they actually were given the aggregate information about what others said. It's a bit like what I did by kind of, in the first case, not showing you what the other people's guesses were, right? And in the second case, you saw on the slide, I don't know, what the other people had guessed. Yeah, and that kind of was additional information that you got about the aggregate, what had others said so far. You see how the one is sort of like without social influence, because it's just not possible, because you have no information about what others did. But in the other case, you saw what the others did. And that kind of could potentially inform your decision. So we don't really know if social influence happens there. It's hard to say. I don't know. It's hard to put that in experiment. But in the one case, we can say it cannot impossibly have happened because there was no information. While in the other case, it could have happened. And then they kind of compared after each round. I don't know. Students had also rate their confidence. But then they kind of looked at. So this is sort of now for these different tasks that they have to do, the different guesses that they got. And now we have the first group, which is this case where they have no information, right? And the second one is where they were presented with what the others had said. And what you see here right now, they were asked 5 times the same question. So in the first case where there was no information, I don't know, some people changed their minds, some kind of gave the second round a higher number or a lower number and so on. But that's sort of the values, the guesses stayed high and all over. While in the aggregated information case where people were shown after each round what the others had guessed, what happens, the opinions converge. And actually, this is what you would see, and I don't know, if you would have more people, we could have shown it as well. Like when I show you a distribution of the number of candies in the jar, and then I kind of let it on the screen, then probably you will get like a peak, because then the people who haven't voted yet, they go for the middle. Because they think, oh, maybe the others know it. Yeah? And I want to guess something, or maybe they say, I would have guessed something way, way higher, but everybody seems to guess something around 30, so I go for something like 30. That sort of leads to a convergence in what people say and how they respond. But that convergence also makes the group less diverse. You see, and that's the reason why with social influence, the wisdom of the crowd is not that good anymore. Because then you get like, I don't know, the diversity in opinion goes away. If everybody says the same thing, you lose the additional information that you had by some people bringing in that additional information. And in that study, so they have a measure for group diversity, and then they show that in the case where you have no information, where people just do things without knowing what the others do, the group diversity stays high. While in the case where information is given to individuals, and they have 2 different cases, you can read up more about that in the paper if you want, there the diversity declines. So people become more and more similar with what they guess, what they say. And by doing that, we kind of then have the diversity going away, and that can undermine the wisdom of the crowd. So I think we found it out. So 30, that was pretty bang on. The times I've done this before, actually it was the case that with social influence, the estimate was worse. In our case, actually with social influence, it was better. It doesn't always work, and it's also a numbers game. If you have more hundreds, thousands of people, actually it works better. In a way, I've done it with experts, where I asked an expert in the candy shop, not this time, but another time I've played this, about how many candies there were. And actually the crowd, my students were much better than the expert, than the guy in the candy shop, about how much candy there was in the jar. Anyway, so for Tuesday, you guys read social influence, and we follow up on that. Okay.